Hello. We're going to be reading some more Hitler's Wonderland today. And yesterday, we talked about the organization of the brown shirts. So we talked about the SA, the SS, the Hitler Youth, and the Stahlhelm. And we talked about Hitler's economic reforms and his policy reforms, like his sterilization program. And let me just get this set up again. It's my 14-year anniversary on Twitter. I can't believe I've wasted so much time. I actually didn't really use Twitter until a couple years ago. So it wasn't really that much time, I guess. All right. So today we're going to talk about unemployment and let's see, what was the other chapter? Oh yeah. So I guess we're going to talk about how Hitler helped the poor, and also a little bit maybe from the socialist perspective on what was going on at the time, because there's another chapter that says like from the other side or something. We'll get to that one today also. So I think it's 3 chapters today. We'll finish off at around page 180, and then we should be set up to finish tomorrow, because it's 215 pages, which will leave us at around 35 pages, which we can do tomorrow pretty easily. So I guess we'll just get right into it. Chapter 12, Hitler versus Unemployment. Alice had begun to think that very few things, indeed, were really impossible. Hitler is a fabelhafter Mensch. In 9 months, he has reduced our official unemployment total from 6 million to 3.5 million, is what you hear from all sides. It seems incredible. While all the large countries of the world are vainly attempting to decrease the number of their unemployed, Germany manages to cut hers almost in half in less than a year. The answer to the riddle is that Hitler has used artificial means to achieve his stupendous result. Having now unmasked Hitler's amazing trickery, I can join the chorus of anti-Hitlerites in shouting, "We told you so." At the same time, one cannot help but feel that even artificial methods have a certain value. The man who gets a job after perhaps a year of demoralizing idleness does not worry about how he got the work. All he knows is that he will no longer be obliged to lounge about the streets, and his children will once more be able to eat their fill. And that, after all, is an important point, inasmuch as the state's first consideration should theoretically be the welfare of its citizens. Emergency measures, artificial means, trickery, and so on do not abolish the fact that there are in Germany today 2.5 million men who are drawing a weekly pay envelope instead of a bare pittance from the unemployment dole. The first artificial measure was the displacement of women in industry and commerce. Woman's place is in the home, said the Nazis. She has no right to hold a man's job. Had this decree been issued by the Weimar government, it would have raised a storm of protests from hundreds of women's leagues, women's unions, and women's newspapers. But under Nazi rule, there was not a sound. One of the advantages from a man's point of view of having a dictator. The Nazis' case against women's employment was this. A single woman who supports herself only is considered a parasite because she puts into the state less than she takes out. The married woman, whose husband is also in employment, is only working in order to increase the family funds and thus permit a higher standard of living. Now give these jobs to a man and see what happens. Assuming that he is a single man, his first thought is to get married. That means he will need a home, so the building trade is stimulated. He certainly needs furniture and household goods, and that gives the furnishing trades a fillip. He has to feed his wife and possible children out of his salary, so the provision trade is benefited. The results are easy to determine. By giving men jobs previously held by women, the standard of living of the minority will decrease, while that of the majority will increase. The single woman who is no longer able to earn her living will have to get married and live on half her previous salary, which means that she will no longer be able to afford the luxuries to which she had become accustomed. The luxury trades will suffer, but the principal industries such as food, clothing, and building will improve. The married woman who is helping the family budget will go back to her housewifely duties and also abolish a few luxuries, while the man who took her job will probably marry and thus start a new cycle of expenditure in the basic trades. That is the National Socialist point of view. I am sure it found little favor among hundreds of thousands of women employees who saw in the new decree an attack against individual liberty. It is an attack against their liberty, but one that is based on the same spirit of comradeschaft which preaches the subjugation of personal interests to those of the nation. Not content with forcing employers to replace women workers by men wherever possible, Hitler began coaxing them to take on extra labor, a vision of concentration camps considerably increasing the efficacy of his arguments. Another attack on individual liberty, or is it merely an example of state control of industry? There is indeed an anomaly when firms are allowed to cut their staffs to a bare minimum in order to maintain their profits in hard times. If a producer finds his markets restricted, surely his first consideration should be for his employees and not his profits. What happened in Germany happened all over the world. The moment conditions became a little difficult, there was a general scramble to lower salaries and reduce staffs. Increase your staffs by 10%, Hitler said, and I shall be quite satisfied. With a sotto voce writer to the effect that if the manufacturers or land proprietors did not agree with him, they would see the inside of Oranienburg camp. The next and perhaps most interesting measure for the reduction of unemployment was the development of the Arbeitslager labor camp and the undertaking of an enormous program of public works. At the very mention of the words public works, I can hear a murmur of disapproval from tax-paying citizens. It is a costly procedure, is the objection, and a questionable benefit to the community. In fact, the English government proved beyond a doubt that it was much cheaper to pay each unemployed man a dole of 18 shillings a week than keep him busy building roads and canals. After all, it is the taxpayer's money that counts in a state. Why should his burden be made heavier for the sake of a few roads? Why should millions of honest, upstanding citizens be reduced by idleness to an apathetic, discontented mass of humanity, losing their courage, their self-respect, and their desire to work? Was man ever made to live in idleness and poverty, his sole occupation being a periodical visit to the unemployment bureau to draw his dole? The Nazis think not. They know quite well that public works will cost far more than the dole alone, but to them the difference is fully compensated by the moral regeneration of the workers. To give back a man for his self-respect and aim in life, and a zest for work in place of his slothfulness, is worth more than 3 times the amount of the dole. The Germans have apparently discovered that a man's soul, be he but a common laborer, is more important than money. And there's something I want to look up here. It might be relevant, it might not be. Just the name of that camp seemed familiar to me. No, I guess not. I was thinking of something else. All right, we'll get back into it. To restore the morale of Germany's youth and at the same time give the older men a better chance on the employment market, the Nazis spent large sums on their Arbeitslager and public works. The labor camps were to be used in another National Socialist scheme, which included the improvement of the land, restoration of respect for manual labor, and destruction of class hatred. This scheme, which was called the Arbeitsdienst, the labor service, intended to make a short stay in a labor camp a compulsory part of education. At the time of writing these pages, the Arbeitsdienst is still a voluntary affair for the working class. In the summer of 1933, there were about 4,300 of these labor camps, employing over 300,000 young men aged between 18 and 25. These camps were scattered around the country and were nearly always alike. An old farm building, a large shed, or a disused factory might house from 10 to 100 men. Rooms were transformed into dormitories by building rows of wooden bunks along the walls. The refectory, consisting of wooden tables and benches, was usually decorated with a picture of Hitler and a few Nazi banners. The routine was always the same. 5:30 a.m., reveille, physical drill, and a cup of coffee. March to work and breakfast at 9 a.m. 2 p.m., return to camps. 3 p.m., lunch and compulsory rest period. 5 p.m., sports, games, instruction, and drill. 7 p.m., supper and recreation. 10 p.m., lights out. Not a very exciting life, perhaps, but even the routine of a labor camp seems enjoyable after months of dreary idleness in the cities. Most of the men seemed carefree and happy, and those with whom I spoke were always very cheerful. The sleeping quarters are quite comfortable, the food is wholesome, and they receive 2 marks a week pocket money, which allows them to buy chocolate or cigarettes. The work they do is sometimes back-breaking, but they are apparently never asked to do anything impossible. Marquise Stevens, a young American student at the University of Berlin, spent 3 weeks in the Holbeck labor camp, about which he wrote, quote, "Although life in a labor camp is damned hard, there are also many happy hours. For instance, at the end of my first week in Holbeck, we held a sports gymkhana, and during the whole afternoon and late into the night, there was a great deal of joyful activity. After a hard task is accomplished, one always sees happy faces. Why not? The men have something to do. They have no board and lodgings to pay, and they receive a little pocket money. One could say they were completely trouble-free. I enjoyed eating, sleeping, and working with the volunteers, who taught me a great deal of German, and with whom I spent many enjoyable days." End quote. Most of the work done by the labor camps is land improvement. It has been estimated that 2 million acres of wasteland could be made cultivable in a few years. The District of Hanover stated that their program of land improvement would keep 100,000 men busy for 10 years. Certain parts of Germany have a soil that requires additional irrigation, while other parts are spoiled by swamps. It will be the work of the volunteers to dig irrigation ditches, widen and straighten existing streams, cut down diseased trees and plant new ones, and so on. In the Velten district near Berlin, I saw 160 men engaged in planting trees on land, which had previously been destined for a new factory. The firm had gone bankrupt and the factory was never built. A little farther on, about 50 men were building huge barracks to house the volunteers during the winter. As I said before, the labor service is still voluntary for the workers, but it is compulsory for university students, professors, and for candidates for office of any kind, who have to spend at least 10 weeks in a labor camp. Certain factories have decreed that they would not employ young men until these had done service in a camp. Eventually, it is to be expected that no young man will be eligible for the civil service until he has been in a camp for a few weeks. Whether the Nazis will be able to add 2 million acres to Germany's agricultural resources is not as important as their determination to use the Arbeitsdienst for the education of youth on National Socialist lines. The idea of making young men work in a labor camp is to restore their respect for manual labor and thus destroy the modern idea that common laborers are an inferior race. After the war, Germany saw her youth making a dash for the liberal professions. They wanted to be lawyers, doctors, engineers, and officials, so that the majority could put a doctor before their name, and thus hoist themselves far above the common herd. Parents scraped and saved for years to send their children to a university. Although they themselves were probably of peasant or working-class stock, the dream of every German was to hear her son addressed as Herr Doctor. The result was inevitable. Lawyers, doctors, and engineers stood in unemployment queues or begged for charity. Diverting youth from the professions into manual trades is quite compatible with the Nazi policy of encouraging the Kleinhandel, the small masters. It is a well-known economic law that the nation of small masters need never fear unemployment or world crises. The Nazi ideal would be to increase the number of small farmers, artisans, tradesmen, and so on, but to do that, youth must be educated to consider these occupations as honorable ones, quite as honorable as those which allowed the use of a title. Having restored a respect for manual labor, the next step is to establish a cordial feeling of camaraderie between the working class and the so-called brain workers. Hitler's idea was, quote, "Intellectual and manual workers must not stand one against the other. For that reason, we are determined to destroy any feeling of self-sufficient conceit which causes a man to look down on his comrade because he is merely a workman behind his machine or his plow. Every German must do some manual labor. Inversely, every worker must be taught that intellectuals are needed for the common good." End quote. And that's from Hitler's speech on the Tempelhof Feld, May 1st, 1933. The Arbeitsdienst is a great step towards the destruction of class hatred, which is nearly always based on misunderstanding. Hitler has been accused of trying to reduce Germany to a one-class nation. What he is actually doing is not abolishing genuine class distinction, but the illegitimate product of the last few years. Dictators may come and they may go, but the respect accorded to the upper classes by the masses will always remain. Old families, old names and titles, they are the real upper class. Centuries of refinement and culture have given it the right to stand at the head of the nation's life, and the masses would not have it otherwise in any case. But can anyone explain the phenomenon by which a youth whose father and mother were peasants look down on the peasant class because he has spent 4 years in a university? A man works as a farmer or an artisan, saves a little money to send his son to a better class school, and before long the son is feeling superior to his father. After school, the youth would rather die than continue his father's trade, too degrading. He prefers to work in an office as a clerk because nothing would induce him to roll up his sleeves and handle the plow or the hammer as his father did before him. In that way there is built up a distinctive class of men who are neither bourgeois nor working class, but the bastard offspring of both. Their petty snobbishness is immense. Their class consciousness is painful, and their utility in the nation's development is extremely doubtful. They are clerks in offices and factories, shop assistants, hangers-on in every trade. They are often too proud to stand in unemployment queues with the common herd, so they slowly starve to death. They make up the huge army of invisible unemployed, whose members are physically and morally disintegrating, far below the standard of the working class, which they despise. It is this class, principally, that is threatened by Hitler's reforms. The battalion of miserable, useless Herr Doctors and so-called brain workers will be sent back to the land and the factory where their fathers worked before them. And those who have real merit and are eligible for intellectual employment will be taught by the Arbeitsdienst to respect the working class. In this way it is hoped to destroy the very foundations of that class hatred which led to the development of communism through industry and commerce into complete chaos and caused the death of many German citizens. I'm going to look up how to pronounce this word because it keeps showing up. I was just gonna roll with it and ignore it. But pronunciation. All right. Teach me how to do it. All right. I guess I was doing it kind of right. I can't roll my R's, but Arbeitsdienst. All that I've written about the Arbeitsdienst is but a reflection of that idealism so characteristic of the Nordic races. To the Germans, a labor camp becomes the flaming emblem of a new era. A few thousand dilapidated sheds with their wooden bunks become synonymous of progress and civilization. They see the youth of Germany giving their voluntary services for the welfare of the nation. They see thousands of acres of wasteland turned into fertile farms. New forests are planted, bridges are built, canals constructed, and roads improved. In East Prussia, they visualize thousands of small farmsteads surrounded by acres of golden wheat. Frederick the Great dreamed the same things, and he did what he could to transform his idealism into reality. 200 years later, the Nazis have been fired with the same idea. Perhaps, if it has survived the passage of time, this dream is not quite as impracticable as it appears on the surface. And that's it for that chapter. I guess nothing that we didn't already really know. Just a little bit more about how Hitler reformed the labor service, and I guess how it approached or confronted the socialist idea of class warfare. But other than that, there's not really much to say. I mean, not for me anyway. Chapter 13. No one shall starve. Beautiful soup, so rich and green, waiting in a hot tureen. "No one shall starve or freeze this winter," said Hitler in a broadcast speech to the nation, and within a few weeks Germany had built up one of the most gigantic charity organizations the world has ever seen. In an unbelievably short time, the Winter Relief was organized throughout the Reich. Hundreds of thousands of citizens offered their voluntary services. Millions of marks poured into the central fund. Unemployed men, stormtroopers, and Hitler Jugend put themselves at the disposal of the authorities, and Germans, whose incomes were already heavily reduced, dug down in their pockets and brought out a few extra marks. In short, 50 million men and women threw themselves wholeheartedly into the work of succoring 15 million compatriots. Once again, it was a manifestation of the Comradeschaft allied with the Christian doctrine of charity. 15 million Germans received relief from the Winterhilfe. In 3 months, potatoes to the value of 20 million marks were distributed to the needy, who also received 52 million marks worth of cereals, 20 million hundredweight of coal, and 125 million marks in cash. There's a footnote that gives us the complete figures for the winter of 1933 through 34. It has food to the value of 140 million marks, clothing to the value of 60 million marks, fuel to the value of 85 million marks, cash vouchers and various other expenses, I guess, to the value of 35 million marks, to a total of 320 million marks, which was approximately 25 million pounds at the time that this book was written. But continuing on with the text, in Berlin alone, over 1 million men and women required assistance from the organization, and the relief work was carried to the remotest villages of the Reich. All the existing charity organizations were put under one control so that nothing would be lost by inefficiency or competition. There were many such independent benevolent societies, but, as usual, they worked apart instead of together for the common good. To give credit where credit is due, it must be chronicled that the forerunners of the Winterhilfe were the German women. Months before the government took things into their hands, thousands of women formed themselves into a league for the relief of the poor. They formed part of the NS Frauenschaft, National Socialist Women's League, and under the direction of women leaders laid the foundations of what was destined to become the Winter Relief Organization. Their first move was to visit farms to collect vegetables and fruit. Farmers were quite generous, and in a short time several thousand pounds of provisions were gathered and stored. To prevent wastage, large quantities of vegetables and fruit were cooked and preserved. One can imagine the tremendous amount of work this entailed. In the smaller villages, where people still baked their own bread, quantities of wheat and rye were begged from farmers. Millers were asked to grind the cereals free of charge, and then thousands of loaves of bread were turned out. There was no bureaucracy, no proper organization, but legions of destitute men can testify to the splendid work done by the women of the Reich. They were the real pioneers. It was only after they had been working several months that Nazi officials sat up and took notice. Then Hitler made his speech. The press and broadcasting stations shouted the plea for charity. The SA was roped in to help, and the immense work of the Winterhilfe began in earnest. "The men have taken the management of our charity work away from us," one of the women pioneers told me sadly. "They have made it into a wonderful organization, but what? But they have forgotten to give us any credit for our spade work. Men are like that, nicht wahr? They have forgotten the unpleasantness we had to tolerate. We went around begging for fruit and cereals, the hours spent in our steamy kitchens, boiling pounds of preserves, the backaches from making so much bread. Where a few women went around the farms collecting food, there are now SA men with trucks. Farmers contribute potatoes, vegetables, and cereals. The potatoes are taken straight to the railways and loaded into special trains which the railway authorities have put at the disposal of the relief. I went to a station to see one of these trains being unloaded by SA men and unemployed. Tons of potatoes, trainloads of potatoes, some from Pomerania, others from Saxony, all for the relief of 1 million starving Germans. The unloading is backbreaking work for which the men receive no other pay than a good hot lunch at midday. The cereals that form a large part of the farmer's contribution are usually taken to millers in exchange for flour, or else they are given to bakery concerns in exchange for bread. The vegetables and fruit are still left to the women, who continue to make preserves, but this time in large kitchens established for the purpose. These kitchens also serve the purpose of cooking free meals for those who are completely destitute. In Berlin alone, 3,000 people are fed every day, until one has seen these Wolfarkuchen. One cannot imagine the self-sacrificing devotion of the women of all classes who work like slaves to prepare meals for their unfortunate compatriots. Substantial meals they are too, the most popular dish of all being the Urbansuppe, split pea soup with large pieces of pork added for flavor. I have seen saucepans the size of a child's bath filled with this golden brown soup, whose delicious taste will remain in my memory for a long time. Free meals are only given to the homeless, because those who have a home receive the food from the distributing centers and cook it themselves. 100 weight of potatoes per head and per month is the ration. Men and women arrive at the distributions with little carts and sacks. The sacks are filled, and the people go away with a happy smile, secure in the knowledge that the wolf will be foiled for at least another month. Cash coupons are also distributed for salt, coffee, etc. These are taken by the shops in exchange for goods, and later redeemed at their face value by the Central Relief Funds. In 3 months, it is estimated that Berlin tradesmen made 2 million marks by the system of coupons. Hitler had said that no one should freeze, so the relief works set about to organize the free distribution of fuel. They sent emissaries to the coal mines to bargain for reduced prices on large quantities. Coal merchants were asked to make contributions in kind instead of cash. Peat growers were asked to increase their production, and the trees that were cut down by the Arbeitsdienst helped to swell the stores of fuel. 100 weight of coal per head and per month was the standard ration, but in extraordinary cases like those of the completely destitute people living in wooden shacks on the city's outskirts, the ration was increased to 200 weight. Distributing food and fuel are the two most important tasks for the Winterhilfe, but one part of the organization is concerned with finding clothes to protect the poor during the coldest part of the winter. This is done either by negotiating with wholesale clothing firms for large lots of clothes at reduced prices, or by collecting cast-off clothing from door to door. This work was done very thoroughly by the stormtroopers, who usually worked in 2s or 3s. One of the men was provided with a bugle, which he blew at regular intervals, while the others pushed the barrow or hand cart containing the clothes. These collections yielded huge quantities of apparel, and although there have not been any total figures published, Berlin collections give an idea of the numbers. 100,000 pairs of shoes, 10,000 overcoats, 2,000 women's dresses, 5,000 men's suits. Everything is taken to disinfection chambers and thoroughly cleaned, and then, if there are any repairs to be made, the women look after that side of the collections. I visited one of these Nähstuben sewing circles in the Mariendorf district of Berlin. In a large room, there were 50 women busily repairing old clothes or making new ones. Some were knitting socks and pullovers, others were making children's garments. These sewing circles meet once a week from 7 until 10 in the evening, and the one I saw was started by Frau B. with 5 of her friends. All this work naturally costs money, and despite voluntary labor and free gifts, the Winterhilfe is obliged to spend millions of marks in cash. The powerful resources of the propaganda ministry were brought into play to broadcast another slogan: "Do your part." And there's a footnote here. It says nearly all the Nazis' ideas were put into slogans for the masses. It has become a habit in Germany under Hitler. And that's the end of the footnote. Every citizen was asked to contribute something to the funds, even if it was only a humble pfennig, which is 1/100th of a mark. In industry and trades, workers were asked to contribute the equivalent of 1 hour's pay every month. The owners of post office savings accounts were encouraged to let a small sum be automatically written off every month. These contributions from investors and workers reached amazing proportions. One day I calculated a total of 60,000 marks, which was around 3,000 pounds at the time that this was written. The most picturesque of all the ideas for augmenting Winterhilfe funds was the institution of soup Sundays, the Eintopfgericht, these, which really means a one-course meal. Hitler appealed to the nation to make a small sacrifice on the first Sunday of the month to help the needy. Everybody should eat a one-course lunch and give the money nominally saved to the relief funds. This idea appealed to the popular imagination and was a great success. On the first Sunday of every month, thousands of families sat down to a simple meal, feeling that they were spiritually sharing the lot of their more unfortunate compatriots. Restaurants also observed the one-course meal custom. Before 5 o'clock in the afternoon, only Eintopfgericht were served, but the customer paid a small sum extra according to the class of establishment. All the money was collected from the restaurants and homes by stormtroopers or volunteers. In Berlin, the first Sunday in November 1933 netted over 500,000 marks, which was around 25,000 pounds. And the total for the whole country during 5 months was about 20 million marks, which was about 1.5 million pounds. In connection with these soup Sundays, I was much amused to see some enterprising men selling booklets in the streets, entitled 100 Different One-Course Lunches. The booklets were a great success. The enthusiasm of the masses for the Winterhilfe was one of the most astounding sights in the New Germany. It was a great success from the start, and as far as one can ascertain, the first elan did not abate throughout the winter. It was a similar spirit to that which reigned in many countries during the war, but instead of requiring a serious emergency to stimulate their sense of charity, the Germans responded to Hitler's appeal for comradeschaft in times of peace. In other countries where misery also exists, the indifference of the masses towards misery and want is the surest proof that Christianity is in danger of becoming a word instead of a religion. Love thy neighbor is the doctrine, but its practical application is rather elementary. Our modern states pride themselves on their workhouses, old age institutions, free clinics, but all these are not the expression of a nation's wholehearted sense of charity. A few pence are added to the citizen's income tax, but no appeal is made to his heart. If that is liberalism, it should be replaced by nationalism. It is that very spirit of nationalism that lies at the bottom of the Winterhilfe. As I write this, I can visualize enormous mounds of potatoes, vegetables, fruit, and cereals, gallons of milk, and thousands of eggs, the farmer's contribution to the cause of charity. I can see hundreds of thousands of women giving up their leisure hours to cook food, bake bread, and mend clothes, all for the cause of charity. The youth of Germany, in the shape of stormtroopers and Hitler Jugend, unloading tons of provisions, transporting fuel, collecting clothes and money, all for the cause of charity. Their reward is not money, nor glory, nor public recognition. Their only reward is the inner feeling that they are helping the fatherland and behaving as true patriots and sincere Christians. That's the end of that chapter, and there's not much to say about it. Just shows the kind of state-sponsored charity or welfare that was provided in the form of soup kitchens and the like. And earlier he was talking about women being taken out of industry, and I've kind of read other things that maybe contradict that. I don't know which is more accurate, or maybe just at different periods of time during the Nazi rule, it became different. So like maybe once they were focusing more on rearmament, maybe women were able to go back into industry. But the way I always read it, it was like, being a mother or being a homemaker was encouraged and there were benefits to it, but they still had the option to be in industry, was my understanding. Of course, I could be wrong, but that was the way I understood it to be. And I think this is the last chapter we'll do today. I'm going to see if my tea is cool enough to drink yet, so I can stop hacking into the microphone. Almost. It's getting there. All right. Chapter 14, The Other Side. It's really dreadful, Alice thought. The way all the creatures argue, it's enough to drive one crazy. Having chronicled the principal events which led to the creation of the Third Reich and explained some of the more interesting changes made by the Nazis in Germany's social and economic life, it is only fair that other people's opinions on the same subjects should be presented to the reader. First comes the socialist, Mr. H. N. Brailsford, in a pamphlet entitled The Nazi Terror, published by the Socialist League in London. Quote, the Nazi movement represented a violent reaction against democracy, pacifism, and internationalism. It is, however, significant that its main attack was directed against the Social Democrats, although they held office only for 6 of the Republic's 14 years and were for most of the time only an item in coalitions. It was hostile in a less degree to the Catholic Center Party because it had cooperated with the Social Democrats, and also, though Hitler is a Catholic, to the Church, because it is an international organization. Nazis emphasize race and seek to clean Germany of everything un-German, meaning chiefly the Jews. Their anti-Semitism, like their hostility to social democracy, is mainly economic in origin, although amongst the crimes of the Jews is the fact that they tend, both in politics and the arts, to gravitate to the left. The main body of Hitler's following comes from the poorer strata of the middle class. The smaller shopkeepers, the clerks, and the less successful professional men have suffered in their competition with Jewish intelligence. While Jews account for less than 1% of the German population, their importance, both in the learned professions and in commerce, especially chain stores, is out of all proportion to their numbers. Doubtless for the same economic reasons, Nazis are anti-feminist as well as anti-Semitic. Women have become troublesome competitors, therefore their place should once more be the home. To disenfranchise them was part of the general program of reaction. Today they might not mourn the loss of the vote, but should they be forbidden to earn their bread, and this in some fields may happen, they may show spirit. The German middle class, which lost its savings during the period of inflation, feels that its standards have fallen relatively to those of the workers. This feeling found expression in the Nazi antagonism to the trade unions. Hitler, who came of a poor middle-class family but had worked as a house painter, did contrive, however, to attract a considerable working-class following. His party professes a muddled, emotional pseudo-socialism. It abuses bankers, assails usury, has talked of abolishing interest. It even favors the nationalization of land, banks, and trusts. Many of the less intelligent workers, attracted by its revolutionary posturing, swung an uncertain allegiance between the Nazis and the Communists, even while these two were engaged in continual skirmishes in the streets. It fed them in its soup kitchens and gave them a smart uniform. Finally, Hitler used methods of demagogic propaganda wholly new to Germany and applied them crudely and without scruple, yet with great inventive skill. Other parties, more especially the Social Democrats, had worked on the assumption that Germans in the mass are an intelligent and highly educated people. Hitler knew better. Every nation has its stupid half. His organization of a numerous partisan army, which now carries revolvers and often carbines, served 2 purposes. It attracted youths, often unemployed, and kept them amused, while it taught them obedience. This army, of course, was raised only for the internal class war, which is plainly Hitler's chief preoccupation. He will not fight the French. They are well armed. Jews and socialists are safer game. In spite of some pseudo-socialist chatter, Hitler's place in the class struggle is obvious. He is in alliance with the ultra-conservative and monarchist party of Hugenberg, the German nationalists. His funds, it is widely believed, come largely from the big industrialists. His first speech, after he had won his majority, emphasized his faith in private property and enterprise, and was followed by a boom on the Berlin Stock Exchange. Within a few hours of this opportune event, the Reichstag fire, Hitler suspended all articles of the Constitution relating to liberty of the person, freedom of expression, of the press, and of assembly, the inviolability of the post, the privacy of domicile, and the protection of property. The Nazi terror had begun. Several hundreds of communist deputies and party officials were arrested. The houses of several socialist deputies were also raided at night, and in one case, 8 shots were fired into the deputy's bedroom. These local murderers and outrages were more systematic than they might appear, yet there had been no riots and no provocation from the other side. After this victory, the Nazi terror was accentuated. Officially, the process is known as cleaning up. Everywhere, the party consolidated its power by destroying the autonomy of the federal states. Their ministries were dismissed, and Nazi commissioners set up as dictators. Socialist members were driven out of the municipal councils and often imprisoned in a body. The brunt of the terror fell, however, on communists, socialists, and pacifists. Their houses were systematically raided by Nazi stormtroopers. The victims were either beaten on the spot or more frequently taken to the Nazi barracks, and there mercilessly beaten and sometimes tortured with scientific ingenuity. They were then usually released, sometimes with a broken nose or the loss of an eye, but the more important were imprisoned indefinitely. Many, probably hundreds, lost their lives, and in lonely places the corpses of men shot dead were occasionally found. All this violence, a tale of raids, beatings, crude torment, and killing, was wrought by armed men upon unarmed men. Nothing can be said in excuse for these evidently systematic outrages, save that the Nazi troopers are mostly very young, that they have been taught to look up to Hitler as a messiah, that by daily propaganda, prolonged for several years, they have learned to regard their opponents as traitors guilty of every imaginable wickedness, and finally, that in every speech, their inspired leader uses words such as brutal, merciless, and even barbarous as terms of praise. Finally, to complete this picture of a great country rattling back to barbarism, one must briefly chronicle its outbreak of Christian enthusiasm. Step by step, with the political terror, went the racial persecution. Many of these victims of the left were Jews, but in addition to these, thousands suffered violence who had no connection with politics. The Nazi policy seems to be to deprive the Jews of the means to live, and yet to compel them to starve on German soil. Many suicides of prominent Jews are reported. To express this condemnation is our duty and our right, whether the victims are our own socialist comrades or these unhappy Jews." End quote. And let's see. I've read a few of Hitler's speeches, a decent number of what has been published in English and translated. I don't recall any speeches of praising barbarism and brutal and merciless, using those as terms of praise. I don't recall any speech where that was the case. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but and there was another thing here where he's talking about France. Where was that at? Oh yeah, at the end of this first paragraph up here. So I mentioned in my stream last year when I was talking about my 1939 edition of Mein Kampf, which was written before or published before the war, translated and published. There's you always have the footnotes full of whining academics, but in the footnotes of my copy, they say the same thing. They're like, well, Hitler, they think he's going to go to war, but they don't think he's going to go to war with France. They were like, France is too strong. France and Poland, or wait, no, I'm actually wrong. They said he was going to go to war with France. They said he wasn't going to go to war with Poland because Poland was too strong. Polish military too good. So they said Hitler would invade France first. But it was actually the other way around. So I was incorrect to connect those two things. But it's still a interesting bit of information, nevertheless, that many academics at the time, many political commentators believed that Hitler would invade France over Poland. I mean, he didn't want anything in France. He was pretty open about what he wanted. All right. I didn't really consider a lot of this to be a criticism. It's like one of those memes where people are like, I'm already voting for him. You don't have to convince me. This last part where he talks about the Nazi terror that Michael Fry has already covered earlier in the book. All right, well, we'll continue on, though. So much for the socialist point of view. Now comes the mass condemnation of Hitler, which took place in Madison Square Garden in New York City in March 1934. The occasion was a mock trial of the case of civilization against Hitlerism, where, while the garden rocked with deafening tumult, the German chancellor was weighed and found wanting. Approximately 22,000 citizens, sitting in judgment on Hitlerism, solemnly declared the National Socialist government of Germany has turned its face against historic progress and the positive blessings and achievements of modern civilization. It has shown itself by doctrine and practice to be the avowed enemy of those methods of peace and freedom by which the march of civilization has been enabled and the progress of mankind accomplished. Roger N. Baldwin, director of the American Civil Liberties Union, testified as follows, quote, "Despite their pretension to socialism, National Socialism is a program of stagnation by force. Just one good word may be said for it. It is the last possible stage of reaction, the last stronghold under the state of the privileged classes. It cannot endure. Its violent attempt to harness a desperate working class, its hysterical effort to buttress a decaying economic system through middle-class support against the masses, makes only more certain its ultimate destruction. Economic collapse or war will engulf it." End quote. You see this kind of thing a lot with commenters on the Nazi system. As he says, it's the privileged classes, but when you look up who made up the Nazi government, none of these people came really from privileged classes. I mean, a few of them did, but for the most part, you had, people like Alfred Rosenberg, who was kind of an exile from the Soviet Union. He was from Latvia. You had, Hitler, who was a nobody. Goebbels is basically a nobody. I mean, he had enough money to go to college. That's about it. But they always try to make it seem like it's this elite group of people taking advantage of the workers to consolidate power. The Reverend Dr. Arthur J. Brown, chairman of the American Committee on Religious Rights and Minorities, said, quote, "Let us be clear as to what we are objecting to. What is civilization's case against Hitlerism? It is not her form of government, not her demand for equality, not her protests against the restrictions imposed upon her by the Treaty of Versailles. Whatever we may think of these things, we are not here to denounce them. What we do object to is that Hitler's praiseworthy effort to rehabilitate and inspire the national life is accompanied by a persecution of Jewish citizens which was utterly uncalled for, and which is isolating Germany from other nations, alienating their goodwill, and outraging every sense of justice and humanity. We are concerned solely with the question of justice and humanity, the common and inalienable rights of men everywhere, irrespective of race or religion, rights embedded in the legislation of all civilized nations." End quote. Judge Samuel Seabury added, quote, "Public opinion as the force and boycott as the weapon will break the power of Hitlerism. It will clear it from the pathway of the developing and advanced civilization which it now obstructs, and thus accord to the world the only opportunity it has for the preservation of world peace. This view, Hitlerism, makes of the state an instrumentality of oppression, which kills the power to formulate ideals for the future, lifts a sordid materialism into the seat of power, creates an antagonism between law and justice, divorces the government from any connection with self-government, and so paralyzes human endeavors as to render them incapable of giving expression to those qualities which, under free conditions, are among the glories of humanity." End quote. Mayor LaGuardia, mayor of New York City, whose mother was a Jewess, made a short speech. Quote, "We cannot be expected to maintain friendly relations with any country while the citizens of that country can't have safety within their own borders. Hitler is not fit to have placed in his hands the responsibility of peace in Europe. We know the Nazi government cannot endure." End quote. The final verdict was given, and the Hitler regime condemned for a number of reasons, the most important ones being, quote, "because Hitler and his followers turned their backs on the civilized tradition of government and law and order in Germany, because they have destroyed security of person and property, because they have abolished freedom of association, because they have rendered impossible freedom of teaching and research, and because they seek to enslave instruction in the arts and the sciences to the purposes of the ruling party, regardless of scientific truth and artistic honesty, because they war against and seek to destroy freedom of conscience, because the scientifically false and mythical differences of race have been invoked to deprive the 600,000 Jews of Germany of their civil and human rights and to make them the victims of a policy and a program whose goal is their complete extermination, because they are employing a technique of lies and propaganda to gain their ends in foreign lands with which they are publicly at peace, because by doctrine, by law, and by administrative procedure, they are degrading womanhood in Germany from the position of human beings who share equally with men in the duties and responsibilities of civilized life, because they have robbed the working men of Germany of their right of free association and of the protection by law of their trade union standards and conditions, and because they have subordinated the workers to leaders to whom they stand related as medieval serfs to their masters, because by their financial methods they have cheated and are continuing to cheat both the public and the private creditors of Germany of their due, because, although they speak of peace, they have 1,300,000 marching men in uniform and have made instruction in the art of war a part of the curriculum in every institution of higher education, because they have defied, insulted, and endeavored to disrupt the instrumentalities of international cooperation and international peace, and have by this and other means thrown Europe into a state of war tension such as prevailed in 1914. End quote. Near the end of the Madison Square Garden trial, a woman in the gallery shouted, "It is a lie, Hitler is not like that." She was mobbed and severely assaulted and, according to New York newspapers, was rescued from certain death by the timely intervention of the police. Now the last word is left to Mr. H. Powys Greenwood, writing in The Spectator, London, March 23, 1934. Quote, "The debit side of the balance sheet is immense. Liberty and toleration are gone. Individual suffering has been great, though incomparably less than in Russia. Talent has been crushed or forced to emigrate. A racial association lasting for more than 1,000 years ruthlessly severed. A terrible conflict has arisen between religion and patriotism, and many sincere and noble men are in a state of despair. In the world, Germany stands more isolated than ever since the war. Of practical achievements to their credit, the Nazis can point first and foremost to the unemployment situation. The latest figures show an effective reduction of about 2.5 million, or 40% of the numbers, a year ago. This is coupled with an equally important factor, mitigation of the terrible moral effects of unemployment through the provision of unpaid occupation in stormtroops, party organizations, and the like. Good work is undoubtedly being done towards eliminating corruption in public and business life, and administration is being reorganized on more efficient and economical lines. The principle of leadership has at any rate resulted in action, and many excellent schemes long held up owing to political controversy or inertia are being carried out. Bismarck created political unity of a sort. He gave order and military discipline, but Hitler's aims are far more fundamental. He is creating a national tradition running through all sections and classes of a people, bitterly divided by religion, culture, history, and economic interests. And in so doing, he has completely changed the psychological atmosphere. The soul of the new Germany, the renaissance of values towards which she is striving, centers around the folk movement. Large though the part played by the Gobineau-Chamberlain race theory certainly is, it does not seem to me essential. I have explained unorthodoxy about Nordics and Aryans is very prevalent, but the unorthodox believe almost as profoundly in the German people and their duty to think in terms of racial future as do the fanatics. Here is the super-individual idea, for which the individual is bidden, and is, in fact, prepared to sacrifice himself. The community before the individual is no mere catchword. The ideals of service and self-sacrifice go very deep. However many absurdities, such as the banning of black-faced gollywogs, may surround the thought of future generations, a substantial rise in the birth rate is certain. And, in view of the conscious effort and scientific planning which may be expected, it will be surprising if a considerable reduction in the number of C3s does not ensue. In view of the fate of Hugenberg, I'm just trying to figure out what he means by C3 here. There's only one thing I think of. Whatever, we'll just keep going. In view of the fate of Hugenberg and of the distribution of real power, it is ridiculous to regard the Nazis as the hired lackeys of the capitalists. At any moment, a word from Hitler can break any reactionary resistance. Even Hitler could scarcely falsify this great movement of the people in the interests of privileged classes, and the days when war could be waged to divert attention from social unrest are long past. But there is one possibility which should be squarely faced. If the German people are hemmed in and surrounded by an iron ring, whether camouflaged as a collective system or not, if their legitimate aspirations are thwarted and their tentative moves towards reconciliation with former enemies rejected, if their attempts to get into touch with other peoples, the British people above all, and evoke sympathetic understanding, at least of some of their aims, are met by a persistent barrage of uncomprehending criticism, the chance of influencing the still young plant of National Socialism will be thrown away, and Germany may turn to the blatant gospel of force in her despair. These opinions, those of a socialist, a few leading American citizens, and an English journalist, presented in parallel to my own, should help the reader to gain an all-embracing view of Hitlerism. As an American cartoonist aptly portrayed the question of Germany, sympathizers with Hitler have a strong tendency to use large quantities of whitewash liberally, while anti-Nazis paint Hitler with tar of the deepest black. And now, before I approach the study of Hitlerism and its international aspect, the most serious of all, a few instructive and frequently amusing considerations of the meaning of the word liberty would not be amiss. Throughout the various condemnations of Hitlerism, which emanate from all sides, the word liberty is most frequently used. The following examples are, presumably, included in that word. In the United States of America, each state has its own set of divorce laws. In certain states, divorce is impossible. In others, it is accepted on 15 or more grounds, one of which is certain to fit the case in hand. The town of Reno in Nevada is a notorious example. Before the repeal of Prohibition, 120 million citizens were prevented from legally enjoying a small drink of alcohol, and in certain states to this day, cinemas, gardening, and playing the piano are forbidden on Sundays. These are termed blue laws. Liberty in the United States was also characterized by the complete subjection of individual trades to a system of murderous autocracy known as racketeering, which to the shopkeepers meant the periodical payment of protection money to a gang of criminals to avoid bombs, grenades, machine guns, playfully termed violins, or worse. This system of racketeering, together with organized kidnapping of citizens, their children or relatives, or even pet dogs, is still a thriving industry in America, the land of the free. In England, a country which is often called the stronghold of liberalism, the freedom of the individual citizen is particularly apparent in the domain of amusements and recreation. I'll take a tea break here, although I think we're almost done. All right, continuing on. A man may drink a glass of beer between the hours of 12 a.m. and 2 p.m., and then again between 5:30 p.m. and 10 p.m., but on Sundays he may only drink between 7 p.m. and 10 p.m. These rules vary from one district to another, as in Glasgow, where no drinking is allowed on Sundays, whatever the hour. In London, drinking is generally allowed until 10:30 p.m. However, a man who is turned out of a public house on one side of Oxford Street at 10:30 p.m. is quite free to cross the street and continue his libations until 11 p.m. Then if he wishes to go still further, he has merely to order a sandwich, which he does not want and will not eat anyway, which will be placed on his table, thus giving him the privilege of drinking until midnight. If a man wishes to avoid the trouble of shaving himself on a Sunday, he may go to the local barber, who is prevented by law from shaving him, but the barber can sell the man a razor, brush, and soap, and allow him the use of the barber's chair and mirror. He may also shave the man privately in a hotel room. Then, still in England, there will be no form of amusement on Sundays in the majority of towns and villages, no theaters, cinemas, or dances. Many cinemas at present giving Sunday performances do so against the law and are open to prosecution if any upright citizen cares to turn common informer. On Sundays, too, there will be no tennis, billiards, golf, and other sports. In the bathing beaches will be strictly hemmed in with numerous rules and regulations regarding the type of customers regarding the type of costumes bathers shall wear, where and how these shall be worn, what parts of the beach shall be used for bathing, use of bathing wraps or beach pajamas, and the nefarious practice of sunbathing. In a shop after 7 p.m. can be bought a pound of butter, but no chocolate, and cigarettes shall not be sold after 8 p.m. The latter may, however, be bought out of automatic machines, and so on. In modern Italy, individual liberty is very highly prized, as anyone who has experienced the intolerable spying and discipline of black-shirted fascisti will testify. Which all goes to show that the words individual liberty change their meaning from one longitude to another. What appears to be quite normal to the Englishman typifies insufferable slavery to the Frenchman, while the conditions under which a Chinese coolie spends his life would horrify an inhabitant of Scandinavia. And that's it for that chapter. And that's all we're going to read for today. I don't think there's much to really discuss in these recent chapters. A lot of this kind of reiterates the negative side that our author talked about previously. And then some of them even praise certain things, like here, the bottom of this page, where he talks about reducing unemployment. So these guys just kind of say what we already knew. So next time, it looks like we're going to talk about the international perspective on National Socialism and Hitler's Germany. And we're going to talk about some other stuff. Let's see, what do we got? Warmongers and pacifists. And then we'll be done with the book, really. So we're almost done. So tomorrow will be the last stream for this book, and probably the last stream for a while, because I'm going to be going back to doing 6-day work weeks at work, which means I'll be pretty busy and won't really have time to stream. And until the problems with my ISP are fixed, I don't really want to stream any games on this channel anyway. So things will just be kind of on hold for about a month or so. But that's it for today. Like I said, we'll pick it up again tomorrow and finish this book, and then that'll be it. So thank you for being with me again today. There's nobody in chat, but there were a few people lurking, I saw. So thank you for lurking, and I hope you want to finish this book with me, because we're almost done. And we're going to finish by the end of the week, which is my goal, because it's, quote-unquote banned books week. And this is a book that was actually banned, so it's good to see a fresh perspective on things, even if it's something that would be a little taboo nowadays. I don't think he says anything truly objectionable in this book, but people would still get upset by the contents of it. So yeah, I'll be back tomorrow at around the same time. I usually do my errands on. My channel's gonna get banned? Nah, I'm good. I already said the N-word, and they didn't ban my channel. Because I don't want to censor myself as I'm reading this, so I'm just reading it as the text appears. And one of Michael Fry's quotes that he chose had the N-word in it, and I read it. So if that particular stream didn't get banned, then I think I'm good. I was in the middle of saying something, and then I got derailed. Errands? Oh, yeah. Fridays I usually run errands. and stuff. Try to get stuff done. I call my mommy, talk to her on the phone. She likes to talk for a while, so the stream might be a little later. I'll try to do it around 6 or 6:30, like I've been usually doing, Eastern time, of course. And yeah, I'll see you then. Bye.